there's been a lot of UFO sightings. What do you think about those UFO sightings, and what do you think if any of them are of extraterrestrial origin, and we don't see giant civilizations out in the sky? How do you make sense of that then?
I want to do some clearing of throats, which
Yes.
people like to do on this topic,
Yes.
right? They want to make sure you understand they're saying this and not that, right? So I would say the analysis needs both a prior and a likelihood. So the prior is, what are the scenarios that are at all plausible in terms of what we know about the universe?
Mhm.
And then the likelihood is the particular actual sightings, like how hard are those to explain through various means? I will establish myself as somewhat of an expert on the prior. I would say my studies and the things I've studied make me an expert, and I should stand up and have an opinion on that and be able to explain it. The likelihood, however, is not my area of expertise. That is, I'm not a pilot. I don't do atmospheric studies of things. I haven't studied in detail the various kinds of atmospheric phenomena or whatever that might be used to explain the particular sightings. I can just say from my amateur stance, the sightings look damn puzzling. They do not look easy to dismiss. The attempts I've seen to easily dismiss them seem to me to fail. It seems like these are pretty puzzling, weird stuff that deserve an expert's attention.
So
in terms of considering asking what the likelihood is. So an analogy I would make is a murder trial. Okay. On average, if we say, what's the chance any one person murdered another person as a prior probability? Maybe 1 in 1,000 people get murdered. Maybe each person has 1,000 people around them who could plausibly have done it. So the prior probability of a murder is 1 in a million. But we allow murder trials because often evidence is sufficient to overcome a 1 in a million prior, because the evidence is often strong enough, right? My guess, rough guess, for the UFOs as aliens scenario, at least some of them, is the prior is roughly 1 in 1,000. Much higher than the usual murder trial, plenty high enough that strong physical evidence could put you over the top to think it's more likely than not. But I'm not an expert on that physical evidence. I'm going to leave that part to someone else. I'm going to say the prior is pretty high. This isn't a crazy scenario. So then I can elaborate on where my prior comes from. What scenario could make most sense of this data? My scenario, to make sense, has 2 main parts. First is panspermia siblings. Mm-hmm. So panspermia is the hypothesized process by which life might have arrived on Earth from elsewhere. And a plausible time for that, it would have had to happen very early in Earth's history because we see life early in history. And a plausible time could have been during the stellar nursery where the sun was born with many other stars in the same close proximity, with lots of rocks flying around, able to move things from one place to another. If a rock with life on it from some planet with life came into that stellar nursery, it plausibly could have seeded many planets in that stellar nursery all at the same time. They're all born at the same time in the same place, pretty close to each other.
Nursery.
Lots of rocks flying around. Okay. So a panspermia scenario would then create siblings, i.e., there would be, say, a few thousand other planets out there. So after the nursery forms, it drifts, it separates, they drift apart. And so out there in the galaxy, there would now be a bunch of other stars all formed at the same time, and we can actually spot them in terms of their spectrum. And they would have then started on the same path of life as we did, with that life being seeded, but they would move at different rates. And most likely, most of them would never, reach an advanced level before the deadline, but maybe one other did, and maybe it did before us. So if they did, they could know all of this, and they could go searching for their siblings. That is, they could look in the sky for the other stars that match the spectrum that matches the spectrum that came from this nursery. They could identify their sibling stars in the galaxy, the 1,000 of them, and those would be of special interest to them because they would think, well, life might be on those. And they could go looking for them.
Can we just, such a brilliant mathematical, philosophical, physical, biological idea of panspermia siblings, because we all kind of started at a similar time in this local pocket
right
of the universe. And so that changes a lot of the math and
So
the
that would
intuitions.
create this correlation between when
Yes.
advanced life might appear. No longer just random independent spaces in space-time. There'd be this cluster, perhaps.
And that allows interaction between
The elements of the cluster, yes.
non-grabby alien civilizations, like kind of primitive alien civilizations like us with others, and they might be a little bit ahead. That's so fascinating.
They would probably be a lot ahead. So the puzzle is,
sure.
if they if they happened before us, they probably happened hundreds of millions of years before us.
But less than a billion.
Less than a billion, but still plenty of time that they could have become grabby and filled the galaxy and gone beyond. So there'd be plenty. So the fact is they chose not to become grabby. That would have to be the interpretation. If we have panspermia siblings,
plenty of time to become grabby, you said. So
yes, they had plenty of time and they chose not to.
Are we sure about this? So again, 100 million years is enough.
100 million. So I told you before that I said within 10 million years, our descendants will become grabby or not.
And they'll have that choice. Okay.
Right. And so they clearly more than 10 million years earlier than us. So they chose not to.
But still go on vacation, look around.
So
just not grabby.
If they chose not to expand, that's going to have to be a rule they set to not allow any part of themselves to do it. Like if they let any little ship fly away with the ability to create a colony, the game's over. Then they have prevented, then the universe becomes grabby from their origin with this one colony, right? So in order to prevent their civilization being grabby, they have to have a rule they enforce pretty strongly that no part of them can ever try to do that.
Through a global authoritarian regime or through something that's internal to them, meaning it's part of the nature of life that it doesn't want, as like become advanced.
Political officer in the brain or whatever.
Yes, there's something in human nature that prevents you from or like alien nature,
right?
That as you get more advanced, you become lazier and lazier in terms of exploration and expansion.
So I would say they would have to have enforced a rule against expanding, and that rule would probably make them reluctant to let people leave very far. Any one vacation trip far away could risk an expansion from this vacation trip. So they would probably have a pretty tight lid on just allowing any travel out from their origin in order to enforce this rule. But then we also know, they would have chosen to come here. So clearly they made an exception from their general rule to say, okay, but an expedition to Earth, that should be allowed.
It could be intentional exception or incompetent exception.
But if incompetent, then they couldn't maintain this over 100 million years, this policy of not allowing any expansion. So we have to see they not just had a policy to try, they succeeded over 100 million years in preventing the expansion. That's a substantial competence.
Let me think about this. So you don't think there could be a barrier in 100 million years? You don't think there could be a barrier to like technological barrier to becoming expansionary?
Imagine the Europeans that tried to prevent anybody from leaving Europe to go to the New World. And imagine what it would have taken to make that happen over 100 million years.
Yeah, it's impossible.
They would have had to have very strict, guards at the borders or out on the water saying, no, you can't go.
But just to clarify, you're not suggesting that's actually possible.
I am suggesting it's possible.
I don't know how you keep, in my silly human brain, maybe it's a brain that values freedom, but I don't know how you can keep, no matter how much force, no matter how much censorship or control or so on, I just don't know how you can keep people from exploring into the mysterious, into the unknown.
You're thinking of people. We're talking aliens. So remember, there's a vast space of different possible social creatures they could have evolved from, different kinds of cultures they could be in, different kinds of threats. I mean, there are many things, as you talked about, that most of us would feel very reluctant to do.
Yes.
This isn't one of those, but...
Okay, so how, if the UFO sightings represent alien visitors, how the heck are they getting here under the panspermia siblings?
So panspermia siblings is one part of the scenario, which is that's where they came from. And from that, we can conclude they had this rule against expansion, and they've successfully enforced that. That also creates a plausible agenda for why they would be here. That is, to enforce that rule on us. That is, if we go out and expanding, then we have defeated the purpose of this rule they set up.
Interesting.
Right? So they would be here to convince us to not expand.
Convincing quotes.
Right? Through various mechanisms. So obviously one thing we conclude is they didn't just destroy us. That would have been completely possible, right? So the fact that they're here and we are not destroyed means that they chose not to destroy us. They have some degree of empathy or, whatever their morals are that would make them reluctant to just destroy us. They would rather persuade us.
Destroy their brethren. And so they may have been, there's a difference between arrival and observation. They may have been observing for a very long time.
Exactly.
And they arrived to try to, not to try. I don't think
to
ensure that we don't become grabby.
Which is because we can see that they did not. They must have been forced to rule against that. And they are therefore here to, that's a plausible interpretation why they would risk this expedition when they clearly don't risk very many expeditions over this long period, to allow this one exception, because otherwise, if they don't, we may become grabby. And they could have just destroyed us, but they didn't.
And they're closely monitoring the technological advancing of our civilization. Like what nuclear weapons is one thing. It's like, all right, cool. That might have less to do with nuclear weapons and more with nuclear energy. Maybe they're monitoring fusion closely. Like, how clever are these apes getting?
So no doubt they have a button that if we get too uppity or risky, they can push the button and ensure that we don't expand. But they'd rather do it some other way. So now that explains why they're here and why they aren't out there. But there's another thing that we need to explain. There's another key data we need to explain about UFOs if we're going to have a hypothesis that explains them. And this is something many people have noticed, which is they had two extreme options they could have chosen and didn't choose. They could have either just remained completely invisible. Clearly, an advanced civilization could have been completely invisible. There's no reason they need to fly around and be noticed. They could just be in orbit in dark satellites that are completely invisible to us, watching whatever they want to watch. That would be well within their abilities. That's one thing they could have done. The other thing they could do is just show up and, land on the White House lawn, as they say, and shake hands, like make themselves really obvious. Mm-hmm. They could have done either of those, and they didn't do either of those. That's the next thing you need to explain about UFOs as aliens. Why would they take this intermediate approach of hanging out near the edge of visibility with somewhat impressive mechanisms, but not walking up and introducing themselves, nor just being completely invisible?
So, okay, a lot of questions there. So one, do you think it's obvious where the White House is, or the White House lawn?
It's obvious where there are concentrations of humans that you could go up and introduce.
But is humans the most interesting thing about Earth?
Yeah.
Are you sure about this? Because
if they're worried about an expansion, then they worried about a civilization that could be capable of expansion. Obviously, humans are the civilization on Earth that's by far the closest to being able to expand.
I just don't know if aliens obviously see humans, like the individual humans, like the organ, the meat vehicles, as the center of focus for observing a life on a planet.
They're supposed to be really smart and advanced. Like, this shouldn't be that hard for them.
But I think we're actually the dumb ones, because we think humans are the important things, but it could be our ideas. It could be something about our technologies.
But that's mediated with us. It's correlated with us.
No, we make it seem like it's mediated by us humans. But the focus for alien civilizations might be the AI systems or the technologies themselves. That might be the organism. Like, what humans are like, human is the food, the source of the organism that's under observation, versus
what they wanted to have close contact with was something that was closely near humans, then they would be contacting those, and we would just incidentally see, but we would still see.
But don't you think that isn't it possible, taking their perspective, isn't it possible that they would want to interact with some fundamental aspect that they're interested in without interfering with it? And that's actually no matter how advanced you are, it's very difficult to do. I think
that's puzzling. So, I mean, the prototypical UFO observation is a shiny, big object in the sky that has very rapid acceleration and no apparent, surfaces for using air to manipulate its speed, and the question is, why that, right? Again, if they just, for example, if they just wanted to talk to our computer systems, they could move some sort of a little probe that connects to a wire and reads the reads and sends bits there. They don't need a shiny thing flying in the sky.
But don't you think they would be there? They are or would be looking for the right way to communicate, the right language to communicate. Everything you just said, looking at the computer systems. I mean, that's not a trivial thing. Coming up with a signal that us humans would not freak out too much
Right.
about, but also understand might not be that trivial.
Well, so
How
the
would you
not
talk to the
freak out
ants?
apart is another interesting constraint. So again, I said like the two obvious strategies are just to remain completely invisible and watch, which would be quite feasible, or to just directly interact. Let's come out and be really very direct, right? I mean, there's big things that you can see around. There's big cities. There's aircraft carriers. There's lots of. If you want to just find a big thing and come right up to it and like tap it on the shoulder or whatever, that would be quite feasible. And they're not doing that. So my hypothesis is that one of the other questions there was, do they have a status hierarchy? And I think most animals on Earth who are social animals have status hierarchy. And they would reasonably presume that we have a status hierarchy. And
Take me to your leader.
well, I would say their strategy is to be impressive and sort of get us to see them at the top of our status hierarchy. Just to that's how, for example, we domesticate dogs, right? We convince dogs we're the leader of their pack, right? And we domesticate many animals that way, but as we just swap into the top of their status hierarchy and we say, we're your top status animal, so you should do what we say, you should follow our lead. So the idea that would be they are going to get us to do what they want by being top status. All through history, kings and emperors, et cetera, have tried to impress their citizens and other people by having the bigger palace, the bigger parade, the bigger crown and diamonds, right? Whatever, maybe building a bigger pyramid, et cetera. Just it's a very well-established trend to just be high status by being more impressive than the rest.
To push back, when there's an order of several orders of magnitude of power differential, asymmetry of power, I feel like that status hierarchy no longer applies. It's like mimetic theory. It's like
most emperors are several orders of magnitude more powerful than any one member of their empire.
Let's increase that by even more. So like if I'm interacting with ants,
right,
I no longer feel like I need to establish my power with ants. I actually want to lessen. I want to lower myself to the ants. I want to become the lowest possible ant so that they would welcome me. So I'm less concerned about them worshiping me. I'm more concerned about them welcoming me, integrating
Well, it is
me
important
into
that
their
you be non-threatening and that you be local. So I think, for example, if the aliens had done something really big in the sky, 100 light years away, that would be there, not here.
Yes.
And that could seem threatening. So I think their strategy to be the high status would have to be visible, but to be here and non-threatening.
I just don't know if it's obvious how to do that. Like, take your own perspective.
Yeah.
You see a planet with relatively intelligent, like complex structures being formed, like life forms. We could see this
Right.
in Titan or something like that. The moon,
Right.
Europa. You start to see not just primitive bacterial life, but multicellular life, and it seems to form some very complicated cellular colonies, structures that they're dynamic. There's a lot of stuff going on. Some gigantic cellular automata type of construct. How do you make yourself known to them in an impressive fashion without destroying it? Like, we know how to destroy potentially.
Right. So,
Like,
if you go touch stuff, you're likely to hurt it, right? There's a good risk of hurting something by getting too close and touching it and interacting, right?
Yeah, like landing on a White House lawn.
Right. So the claim is that their current strategy of hanging out at the periphery of our vision and just being very clearly physically impressive with very clear physically impressive abilities is at least a plausible strategy they might use to impress us and convince us sort of we're at the top of their status hierarchy. And I would say if they came closer, not only would they risk hurting us in ways that they couldn't really understand, but more plausibly, they would reveal things about themselves we would hate. So if you look at how we treat other civilizations on Earth and other people, we are generally, interested in foreigners and people from other lands, and we were generally interested in their varying customs, et cetera, until we find out that they do something that violates our moral norms, and then we hate them. And these are aliens, for God's sakes, right?
Yeah.
There's just going to be something about them that we hate. They eat babies. Who knows what it is? But something they don't think is offensive, but that they think we might find. And so they would be risking a lot by revealing a lot about themselves. We would find something we hated.
Interesting. But do you resonate at all with mimetic theory where like we only feel this way about things that are very close to us? So aliens are sufficiently different to where we'll be like fascinated, terrified or fascinated, but not like
Right. But if they want to
annoyed.
be at the top of our status hierarchy to get us to follow them, they
Sure.
can't be too distant. They have to be
Sure.
close enough that we would see them that way, but not
Pretend to be close enough, right?
right.
And not reveal much that mystery, that old Clint Eastwood
Right.
cowboy.
I mean,
Say
the point
less.
is, we're clever enough that we can figure out their agenda. That is just from the fact that we're here. If we see that they're here, we can figure out, oh, they want us not to expand. And look, they are this huge power and they're very impressive. So, and a lot of us don't want to expand. So that could easily tip us over the edge toward, we already wanted to not expand. We already wanted to be able to regulate and have a central community. And here are these very advanced, smart aliens who have survived for 100 million years. And they're telling us not to expand either.
This is brilliant. I love this so much. Returning to panspermia siblings, just to clarify one thing, in that framework, who originated, who planted it? Would it be a grabby alien civilization that planted the siblings, or no?
The simple scenario is that life started on some other planet billions of years ago,
Yes.
and it went through part of the stages of evolution to advanced life, but not all the way to advanced life. And then some rock hit it, grabbed a piece of it on the rock, and that rock drifted for maybe in a million years until it happened to prawn the stellar nursery, where it then seeded many stars.
And something about that life, without being super advanced, it was nevertheless resilient to the harsh conditions of space.
There's some graphs that I've been impressed by that show sort of the level of genetic information in various kinds of life on the history of Earth. And basically, we are now more complex than the earlier life, but the earlier life was still pretty damn complex. Yeah. And so if you actually, project this log graph in history, it looks like it was many billions of years ago when you get down to zero. So plausibly, you could say there was just a lot of evolution that had to happen before to get to the simplest life we've ever seen in history of life on Earth was still pretty damn complicated. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so that's always been this puzzle. How could life get to this enormously complicated level in the short period it seems to at the beginning of Earth history? So it's only 300 million years at most it appeared, and then it was really complicated at that point. So panspermia allows you to explain that complexity by saying, well, it spent another 5 billion years on another planet, going through lots of earlier stages where it was working its way up to the level of complexity you see at the beginning of Earth.
We'll try to talk about other ideas of the origin of life, but let me return to UFO sightings. Is there other explanations that are possible outside of panspermia siblings that can explain no grabby aliens in the sky and yet alien arrival on Earth?
Well, the other categories of explanations that most people will use is, well, first of all, just mistakes, like you're confusing something ordinary for something mysterious, right? Or some sort of secret organization, like our government is secretly messing with us and trying to do a false flag op or whatever, right? Yes. They're trying to convince the Russians or the Chinese that there might be aliens and scare them into not attacking or something, right? Because if the history of World War II say the U.S. government did all these big fake operations where they were faking a lot of big things in order to mess with people. So that's a possibility. The government's been lying and, faking things and paying people to lie about what they saw, et cetera. That's a plausible set of explanations for the range of sightings seen. And another explanation people offer is some other hidden organization on Earth. There's some secret organization somewhere that has much more advanced capabilities than anybody's given it credit for. For some reason, it's been keeping secret. I mean, they all sound somewhat implausible, but again, we're looking for maybe, 1 in 1,000 sort of priors. The question is, could they be in that level of plausibility?